running a little bit late. I have work session at 10 o'clock and we're about 20 minutes late. Local funding for public schools in North Carolina. Mr. Keene, if you will introduce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Presenter.
I think most of us, maybe all but one, maybe two, attended the association's fall conference in 2013, and we heard Kara Millonzi and Commissioner Bell and I, after we got finished, we walked out into the concourse and talked for 30 minutes on what we had just learned. And Commissioner Bell and I, we had discussed maybe hopefully getting someone of this caliber to Wayne County. And it took a lot of coordinating with her schedule, but this morning we have Carol Millonzi, and she's the Associate Professor of Public Law and Government. Her areas of expertise is municipal and county finance law, municipal and county debt, municipal incorporation, local government law, special assessments, public school finance law, utility finance law, solid waste finance law, county attorneys, and economic development. Profiling Kara is a long list here, and I'll just keep it brief, but she joined the School of Government in 2006. She previously practiced law with Testa, Hurwitz, and Thurmbelt in Boston, and clerked for the Honorable Louis Obadifer, United States District Court of District of Columbia. She is a member of the North Carolina State Bar and the Bar of Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Kara earned a BA in Economics, summa cum laude, and Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Buffalo, and an MA in Economics from the University of Maryland at College Park. She earned a JD with highest honors order of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she served as editor-in-chief of the North Carolina Law Review. The commissioners are honored, and Wayne County, I speak for them also, is that we are honored to have you with your expertise, and we look forward to this presentation. Thanks, Kara.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Keene.
Kara,
yes,
just a minute before you start, I would like to thank the part of the school board for being here, and part of the staff from the Board of Education. Do appreciate y'all being here today. Okay, go ahead.
Sure. Well, good morning, and I'm happy to be here this morning. And I want to say first off, in particular, since it sounds like most of you have heard at least a version of the presentation that I had prepared for this morning, I'm happy to go astray and simply answer questions at any time. So certainly feel free to interrupt me. I'm sure you will anyways, but feel free to interrupt me, and whether or not I get through all the slides is not important. I'd rather answer questions to the extent that I can that you have about the local funding process for schools. So let's go ahead and start. What I typically cover, if you want to click it, I'm not used to not being in charge here of that. So Marcia and I will get this down. What typically are the questions that I get from both county commissioners, county staff members, and also local education board members as well, I've distilled down into this set of 5 questions. And I'm not going to run through the questions right now, but this is sort of the loose agenda of what I'll talk about this morning in terms of trying to figure out the contours of the responsibility for schools, in particular the division of responsibilities between county commissioners, and local boards of education. So if we'll start right out with question number 1. And again, I usually set this up presentation style, but I'm not going to make anyone here raise their hand. But question number 1 is sort of a fundamental question. On its surface, it may seem fairly easy, and I think probably most people would agree with the answer. But the question is, what statement or which statement best describes a county's funding responsibilities for its schools? And I'm actually not going to give away the answer at this point. We're going to walk through the statutes to find the answer very quickly, because I think you'll see what looks fairly simple on the surface is actually quite complicated, gray, and all mired up when we actually get into the details. And this is significant, particularly for your board, in making decisions about funding for your schools each year. So we'll drive right into it. Just as a quick background, North Carolina is fairly unique across the country in that most of the funding for schools, the vast majority for funding for schools in the state, comes from the state. Comes from state income tax, state corporate tax, whereas in most states, the majority of funding for schools comes from county governments or from school boards themselves who have taxing authority in a good deal of states across the country. And so that scheme actually came out of the Great Depression. And what happened coming out of the Great Depression is North Carolina local governments were second only to Florida in the number of municipal defaults on debt. That's not a good time to be second, right? It's not a good position to be in. And because local governments in North Carolina had found themselves in that position, the General Assembly at that time, the state government, said, you know what, we don't trust local governments. Not only do we not trust local governments to manage their money, we don't trust local governments to deal with some of the major policy issues facing the state. And the policy decision that was made at that time, one thing that came out of that is the creation of a local government commission, which you may or may not be familiar with, that oversees and actually approves most debt issuances by local governments, also is responsible for your fiscal health. Same thing for public school boards as well. The second thing that came out of that, and these are closely related, the second and third thing are closely related, is that the state decided that it would be the state's responsibility to fund and direct public education for the state, and the state's responsibility to deal with roads. Two things that in most other states are left largely up to local governments. And that's the reason. That came out of the Great Depression. It came out of a distrust of local governments at that time. Well, why do I get into all that? I think it helps set the stage for what this scheme is, at least nominally. And then what we'll see has happened over time is perhaps the best characterization is the General Assembly has a short memory. And so as time has eroded, as we get farther and farther away from the Great Depression and the issues of distrust of local governments, we now see, perhaps inadvertently, perhaps purposely, but in a way that's not as direct as we might like it, the General Assembly has allowed more and more responsibility for both streets, roads, and schools to fall to the local level. And that's part of it, is we're in this transition now in a bit of a gray area. So what we have is this statute, still good law, 115C-408. The statute was enacted in the 1980s as part of a school reform effort at that time, and it was basically a reaffirmation of what had come out of the Great Depression. And that this is a statement, a policy statement, that it's the policy of the state that the state revenue sources will pay for the current operations of the school, and it's the policy of the state that facilities requirements will be paid for by county governments. That's a pretty clear line of delineation in terms of funding responsibility, the one that harkens back from that major policy decision that was made coming out of the Great Depression. Why this policy statement, and why in the 1980s? Why did the General Assembly at that point feel the need to enact this statute? Well, what had happened since the Great Depression up to the 1980s is that you had vast differences in the way counties were funding their schools. Because although the state was providing the bulk of basic financing through the income tax, counties then, the counties that could afford to, were supplementing with county appropriations. So you had some counties that were providing a lot of additional funds for operational expenses to their schools. You had other counties where the counties either chose not to or were financially unable to provide that same level of support. And so you had a great deal of inequality across the board. And so what happened is that the state had to step in and provide more targeted funds of money to certain counties, to certain school systems in certain counties. And on the flip side, the state also had to step in from time to time and provide help with facilities costs, because there were counties, particularly our smaller, more rural counties, had a real hard time even meeting basic facilities needs because they didn't have the economies of scale that a place like Wake County, where they've got huge population and huge economies of scale. So this was a restatement of that policy. And if we were to go back to my initial question, if you flip back one slide here and you looked at that statute, I think it would be pretty clear that a county must provide funding for capital outlay expenditures only would be the answer. But as you know, as I know, that's not the legal answer to this question. The legal answer is actually 3. It used to be C, but it's now 3 on my slide. County must provide funding both for capital outlay and operational expenses. And that must could be underlined. And this is what we're going to tease through now, because I think perhaps the more important question for you all in the decisions you need to make this year and in going forward is, okay, yeah, we probably already understood that, but how much? And what are the limits? And how much control do we have over how that money's spent? And how do we best work with the school board to accomplish what I would imagine, or what I've seen in most counties, is a pretty universal goal of ultimately helping improve the education system in your county. So how do we get to that 3 from that first statute? So if you go, okay, first statute looks like it's A, we now, flip one back. Okay, go flip it, and one more. There we go, thanks. So we go to statute 2. This statute was enacted after 115C408, several years after, actually. And this is actually the statute that sets up the budgeting for local school boards. And it says that the local current expense fund shall means must in legalese, so must include appropriations sufficient when added to the appropriations for the state for the current operating expense of the public school system. And then you go to scroll down to the end, within the financial resources and consistent with the fiscal policies of the Board of County Commissioners. Okay, what? Right, so we started out with this pretty clear delineation of responsibility. And now we have a statute, just a few statutes later, in the same chapter, that indicates that the local current expense fund, which is the fund that only county funds go to. State funds don't go to the local current expense fund. So the local current expense fund has been set up and established only for local funds. So the local current expense fund must include appropriations that when you add them to whatever the school district's getting from the state, they're sufficient to fund the current operations for that year. Oh, by the way, but that has to be within the fiscal resources and fiscal policies of the Board of Commissioners. Okay, so as you see within this one statute, it's creating a bit of a gray area from what was a clear delineation of responsibility, but at the same time, it's implementing sort of a balancing act. A balancing act meaning the county's responsibility is to supplement what the state has appropriated in any given year to fund an education system and what we know from the state Supreme Court to fund a sound basic education in the county. But that has to be counterbalanced with the county's general resources ability to provide that funding and with the County Board of Commissioners' fiscal policies. And we're going to come back and talk about that because this is the crux of where we're at right now in trying to understand who's responsible for what and what the contours of that responsibility are. So if we flip one more. So one more statute, and this is the big stick, as I call it, hanging out there. And this says is that if the Board of Education determines that money appropriated to that local current expense fund is not sufficient. So if a county's appropriations in the eyes of the local school board in any given year are not sufficient, and this is actually true of both capital or operating, we're focusing on operating here, but either capital or operating, then the local school board has a way to initiate what we call a dispute resolution process. And we'll talk about what that process looks like in a minute. But what this, again, sets up, my guess is that this works its way in other counties. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that this way in Wayne County, that at budget time, when you as a board make budget allocations to your finance department. If your finance officer is not happy with those budget allocations, wishes that he or she got more money this year, that he or she doesn't have much recourse. She may complain to the manager, she may run to the public, perhaps. That might be a bit daring for an employee to run to the papers. But there's no legal recourse. That department head is stuck with what he or she got this year in terms of money. That's not true of the school board. Okay, the school board has this method to legally challenge their appropriations in a given year. And that's what makes this relationship very different than your relationship with even your other decentralized boards, such as social services or public health or elections, where they don't have a statutory recourse to challenge the appropriation in a ready fashion. And so that is always hanging out there as a specter in terms of all the decisions that you make are influenced by this potential for this challenge. So let's keep going and talk about where this fits in. This is kind of my cute way of saying, at this point, we're a little bit confused by the statutes, right? We have some statutes that seem to say counties only do facilities. We have other statutes that say, well, no, counties do operation, but only within their financial resources and their fiscal policy. And then we have a statute that says, but if the school board doesn't like what the county commissioners have done, they can challenge it and go through a fairly onerous process, or what can become an onerous process for both boards. And so we're at a point of, okay, that's not much clear guidance, and I'm going to agree. I've studied this for 8 years now. It's not much clear guidance, and it's only going to get worse, but let's keep going on here. So we'll go here. So this is the question that I said that you're probably more interested in as a board, at least those of you who are financially minded, are more interested in, okay, let's assume, as you're telling us, Kara, that we have to appropriate money for facilities and we have to appropriate money for operations. And again, I don't want to set this up as an antagonistic. It could very well be that you all want to appropriate money for both those purposes. That's a goal of this board. But what you're trying to figure out is within your revenue constraints, within all the other things that you want to accomplish as a board, what are the legal responsibilities for determining how much? All right, particularly if your notion of how much differs from the local school board's notion of how much. And so how do those things get reconciled? Okay, so do you have full discretion? I'm going to say the answer to this is a little bit unclear. It's kind of a false dichotomy to say true-false. It probably lies somewhere in the middle. And so let's talk through that. We'll go to the next slide. I know I'm full of non-answers today, right? That's my job. Yeah, I'm a lawyer and a professor, right? So that's the worst combination. So here's the budgeting process. And I will dwell on step one a bit. And I don't know anything about the relationship between the boards in this county, so I'm not presuming one way or the other about that relationship. I certainly have worked with boards. I've done joint meetings with boards of education and boards of commissioners, and those meetings have gone one of two ways. They're usually really productive, good working relationship. Everybody's basically on board. We're just working through the details. Or the boards basically turn their backs on each other and don't even want to be in the same room. It seems like when I get called in, it's usually one of the two extremes of the relationship. But I'll point out that step one of this budgeting process calls for ongoing discussions between the boards. There's actually a statute in 115C that mandates that the Board of County Commissioners and the local school board meet and communicate on a regular basis. And where the Board of Commissioners talks to the school board about your fiscal policies, your fiscal picture for the county, and the school board provides information about the population they're trying to educate and what are the issues, what are the costs involved, what are the things coming down the horizon that will cause increased costs, both on the facility side but also on the operational side. And so there is a statutory directive for boards to meet. Now, there are some counties where I say that, and boards laugh at me, and they say, there's no way. You know, we will talk to each other once a year, and that's at budget time. There's other counties where that's been set up to, where they've got a couple counties where the relationship, there's a meeting of sorts on a monthly basis. It's up to you and the local school board to define how to make use of this statutory directive to your advantage. But I'm a lawyer, not a social scientist, but we have some social scientists on faculty at the School of Government, and they have looked into this issue and sort of mapped out the counties in which there's been legal disputes over budgets and counties which historically have not had any sort of dispute or threat of dispute. And one of the factors that's been identified that's fairly consistent is this communication issue, whether there is ongoing communication between the boards or not. So that, you know, I won't say more about that, but it is a statutorily mandated directive that both boards meet on, and not necessarily meet, but communicate on a regular basis, however you decide to define that. And we have seen some success in smoothing out relationship, preventing surprises, having an ongoing notion of what to expect in counties in which that's occurred. Okay, so whether or not that occurs, the statute then kicks in with a set framework during budget time. This folds into your normal county budget in that the school board actually has, the school superintendent presents a proposed budget to the school board by May 1st. School board can hold a hearing on that, doesn't have to. They can make any changes they want to that school budget, proposed school budget. When they're done and have their full proposed budget, then they have an obligation to send that to your board. And by the way, not to send that to the county manager, who I would assume probably filters all the rest of the budgetary requests. But the statute directs that the school board send their request, their budget, to all of you, to the board itself. And this is not something that legally can be funneled through the manager, where the manager then takes a crack at folding that into the budget process. Legally, your board is supposed to look at that request independent of the proposed manager's budget. The school board also has to send you, legally, their entire budget, not just the portion that is related to what they're requesting from the county. And so the legal obligation is to send you the full budget, what's anticipated revenue-wise from the state, from the federal government, from other sources, and from the county, as well as the full range of expenses. How the school board submits that to you, basically, we used to have what we called a uniform budget format. And that was statutorily, that is still the required format. And there's a uniform chart of accounts that I referenced in the article that I sent earlier to Marcia. My understanding is in the early 1990s, counties wanted some more flexibility, school boards wanted some more flexibility, so we've somewhat abandoned that in practice, this uniform budget format. And each budget format in each county differs. Some budget requests I've seen coming from school boards to counties are this thick, others are 2 or 3 pages. What happens though if you, as a board of commissioners, receive your request, receive your budget from the school board, and you've got questions? You don't understand how the numbers were derived. You want more information about the request. You want more information. Well, you actually have a statutory, thank you, you have a statutory authority to call for the Board of Education, and the Board of Education, as you can read up there, has the duty to make available all books, records, audit reports, and any other information. So you have the authority to go back to the school board and say, look, we want more information. We want to see your financials from last year. We want to see how this money's spent. We want to see how you're deriving these numbers that make up this budget request. We want more financial information. This does not, however, provide authority for you as a board or individual board members to go to the school board and say, we don't like program X, so cut it out of the budget request. The General Assembly has created this delicate balance in terms of who has control of what. They've clearly delegated purse string authority, I'd say clearly, somewhat clearly delegated purse string authority to your board, but they've delegated policy making educational policy making authority, mainly to the State Board of Education, and then also to local boards of education, and to some extent to individual schools. And it's hard sometimes to not have those things intermixed. It's hard sometimes for policy not to drive costs, of course, and to drive the money, and it's hard sometimes for money not to drive the policy. But that's the delicate balance that the two boards, that your two boards have to strike and think through as you work through these funding issues. Okay, we'll keep going. This process, once you make your appropriations, you do that through your county budget ordinance each year. Within 7 days of you adopting that ordinance, if the school board is unhappy with either their operating expense appropriation or their capital expense appropriation, they can institute this dispute resolution process that I referenced earlier. If you go, I've got the whole statute laid out here. They can challenge your appropriation for both capital or operating if it's not deemed sufficient to support a system of free public schools. And I think I have in the next slide the process. Oh, no, I skipped the process. The process is very odd for a dispute resolution process in that every time that I've worked with counties and school boards or talked to counties and school board members after the process. Oh, thank you. It's the next one. Okay. After I've talked to you, no one ever claims that they win. It's almost a universal lose-lose situation. And here's why. So I've got this set up. Here's the process. The process, if you think about this, you're making appropriations in around July, effective July 1st, for that school year that typically begins sometimes in August and runs until the following June when school lets out. So you're making appropriations that will be used starting sometime in August, usually sometime in July, in preparation. And that your appropriations for operating expenses oftentimes includes money for teacher supplements or additional teachers or teachers' assistants. So there's a hiring element of getting bodies in classrooms or hiring other personnel in the school system. Obviously, if those personnel aren't in the classrooms as of August 1st, it's not as effective. If they don't get to come in the classroom till October or November, sometimes it's impossible, but it's certainly not the same as having those additional personnel. So this process, statutorily, this dispute resolution process, is meant to happen very quickly. It's meant to be resolved by the time the school year begins, with one fatal flaw. So if you go through this process, first it involves the board's meeting, you attempt to resolve your differences. A lot of disputes end here. So it may be that once everybody gets in the room, there's some conversations take place, you figure out a compromise. If that doesn't work, you go to mediation, which is a formal mediation where you send representatives in, you have a mediator, you split the cost of that mediator with the school board. If the mediation fails, then the school board may file suit. Again, they have to do that within 5 days, and the mediation is supposed to end by August 1st. This is all supposed to happen fast. The trial court is supposed to make a decision fast. It's supposed to hear this case right away. Typically, the decisions come down in early September. So the school year is usually begun, but the decision comes down fast. Well, here's where things go awry. And so if we go to the next slide, and quite frankly, what usually is the case, if it gets to a trial court, almost always the county is going to be required to come up with more money. That's just what we've seen historically. If it gets to this point, almost always either the judge or jury will award more money to the school board. It may not be as much as the school board's requested, but almost always there is some additional award. But what happens is either the county or the school district can appeal. If it goes to appeal, there's no longer any ability for the General Assembly to control the timetable. Now it's up to the courts. And our appellate courts don't act all that fast. And so what we've seen on average is a decision, a final decision from the appellate courts about 2 to 2.5 years later. Okay, hence lose-lose. Because even if you're the school board and you've been awarded additional funds, remember that means that a judge or a jury found that for that school year, the school board needed those additional funds to provide the basic minimum level of education. You may disagree with the judge or jury on that, but that's what a judge or jury found. But that school board isn't going to get those funds until 2.5 years later. Okay, so the system is set up so that it's a lose-lose if you end up walking all the way through the dispute resolution process. We don't have too many counties and school boards, I think largely because of the way the system works, get to this stage. We did have one this year. We did have one this year, and we can now go back. The recent verdict, this is one that I think might prove a bit scary if you're county commissioners. This was the largest award that I've certainly seen. I don't know if it's the largest in history. I think it probably is, though. In this case, there was a, believe it or not, there was a dispute in which, I should have reviewed the numbers here, but I believe it was something like the school board was asking for an additional $3 million in capital and an additional maybe $6 million or something in operating expenses. That's what the dispute, that's what went to dispute resolution, that's what went. Well, once it got to trial court, what happened is that the judge in that case allowed the school board to then argue about all these facilities requests that had been put off by the county for a number of years. So of this $91 million, what was actually requested at the beginning of the year, how far the parties were off before they went to dispute resolution, I think was under $10 million. Well, the county ended up, the award ended up being $91 million, $86 million of which were for back facilities costs to build. I'm sure it was a new high school, because that's about what they cost in some parts of the world, and some other facilities costs. That once it got to trial, the school board was able to convince the jury that these were costs that had been put off by the county for years and years. The second most recent, the second most recent award was in Duplin County, and that was $4.8 million additional funds. And before that, we had an award in Beaufort County for a few more million. But usually it's for a few additional $1 million. We had not seen the likes of $91 million. So I'm going to come back to that Union County case because I think it has some lessons about the relationship and about how you approach, as a county, this issue with respect to schools and how do you approach it. But let's go ahead, let's move on to here. So if we go past this, so lose-lose, and go ahead and populate the whole thing. There we go. Okay. So just so we're all clear what happens here, I'm not trying to make everybody hungry for lunch. Actually, those don't look all that appetizing. But what basically the scheme that we have that has resulted both as a result of some gray areas left in the statute and also how those statutes have been interpreted by the North Carolina courts is we have a situation where if it gets down to dispute resolution, the argument isn't over how much the county should come up with. The argument is over how big the total pie should be. Meaning, does the school board need the little pie in order to provide the basic education, constitutionally required education for the students in this county this year? Do they need the mid-sized pie, or do they need the large pie? Once the decision about what pie, how big the pie needs to be is made, the amount that the county has to come up with is basically fixed. It's whatever's left, given that the state has already indicated how much they're giving, and the federal government will already have indicated how much they're giving. So the parts of the pie that are already populated there, they're given and they're fixed, and they're not going to change depending on how big the pie is going to be. The state's not going to come back after dispute resolution and say, oh, you know what? Looks like Wayne County needs a little bit more money. You know, they just went through this dispute resolution process. It looks like they need, so we're going to appropriate some more money to the Wayne County School Board. It's not the way it works. The state comes up with its appropriation, and it's through its formulas at budget time. And the county is left to fill in the difference in the pie. And if it goes to dispute resolution, the dispute isn't really over how much should the county put in. It's over how big should the pie be. And then you just do the simple math to figure out how much the county owes. And that's really, I think it's important to understand that, in part because again, I'm not going to presume anything about relationships other than what I've seen in other counties. Sometimes it appears as though there's the relationship between a county commissioner board and a school board is rife with conflict and rife with distrust. But part of why that is because it's statutorily been set up that way. If a school board has directives from the State Board of Education, now also from the federal government, as to the basic education that they have to provide to this population of students in any given year, they're getting a fixed amount of money from the state and a fixed amount of money from the federal government. If they don't think there's enough money, statutorily, they can't go back to the state and say, we demand more money. I mean, they may go to Raleigh, they may argue that, but they don't have any legal way. They don't have a legal way to go after the federal government. They have a legal way to go after the county. And so that part of that antagonistic relationship, to the extent there is one, is driven not by personalities, not by people that you can't trust, but driven by the fact that that's what the statute sets up. And sometimes I think when I say that, it helps a little bit understand how to approach that relationship, that this isn't about they're always trying to get more money from us, we don't understand why, or on the flip side, they're never trying to give us enough money, we don't understand why. It's statutorily set up, one, to be ambiguous as to how much you're supposed to give, and also there's only one way for a school board to get more money in any given year, and that's to either threaten or actually go through this process. And so I think that's important to understand the relationship. We keep going. So before I go quickly to this issue, and I know I want to be cognizant of time, before I go to this issue, I want to touch on the Union County case. And I'm going to ask you to flip way back. I'll tell you when to stop. So I want to go back to one of those initial statutes that I said I was going to come back and talk about. Actually, if you flip to that one, it's highlighted there. Next one. Thank you. Okay, so in that bolded language here, this language, what happens if a dispute resolution process gets to court? What it says is, the statute says the judge or the jury must consider the following: educational goals and policies of the state and the local board of education, the budgetary request of the local board of education, the financial resources of the county and of the local board of education, and the fiscal policies of the Board of County Commissioners and the local board of education. So this is pulling in that statute that I talked about at the very beginning, where it's the weighing of interest. It's the weighing of interest between the school board needs X amount of money to provide sound basic education. School board's going to do everything it can, if it gets to this, to sort of document that need financially, try to quantify it. County, on the other hand, should be in a position to quantify both its fiscal resources and its fiscal policies. And so what I would say to a county board is, to the extent that you have some fiscal policies that you want to implement, it could very well be, we're not going to raise taxes, period. That's a promise we made to our constituents. We're not going to do it. That's a fiscal policy. Put it in writing. Have it well documented. That no matter what, we've got a fixed pot of money. We're not raising taxes, and so we have to fit all our funding responsibilities within this existing pot of money. That could be fiscal. I'm not suggesting it is one. I'm not suggesting it's good or bad. I'm just using it as an example as a potential fiscal policy. Usually they're more nuanced than that. They have more dimensions than simply, we're not going to raise property taxes. They're more nuanced. But the more you as a board can wrestle with what your fiscal policy is as a county, the more memorialized it is, and the more you actually follow it. Because it's one thing to have a fiscal policy that you only talk about if you're in litigation, and oh, by the way, you've raised taxes for the past 3 years to cover other expenses. That's probably not a true fiscal policy. That's a fiscal policy in name only. But that is something that if you in a county, if you're found in a situation like this, but also just in your approach with the school board to understand what does it cost to provide the sound basic education, but for the school board to understand, well, you know what, in this county, we can only afford X because we have all of these other things to do, and we've got a populace that doesn't want more money going to government right now. And those are constraints that can be real. And they're policies that you have all been elected to enact. And that's the balancing. And what I'm telling county commissioners, and I'm also saying this to school boards, is those discussions need to happen now, not when the specter of litigation. Those needs to be ongoing discussions, ongoing issues, both within your board, but also between the boards, in order for this to actually have meaning. We go back to that Union County case. That was actually the first case that was decided under this new set of principles. That it's actually new, coming down from the North Carolina Supreme Court, that the jury has been forced to consider the county's fiscal policies and fiscal resources. And so you might say, okay, that didn't work out so well for Union County. You know, now supposedly that was supposed to help counties, this new directive to the judge or jury. It didn't seem to work out that way. Well, here's what happened in Union County. Union County had a fund balance of $100 million. They were using fund balance to save for some future projects. And so when the county, during the trial court, when the county argued to the jury, we don't have the fiscal resources for this. Our fiscal policy is to not raise taxes, not to bring in any additional revenue that we don't need. The school board turned around and said, but wait a minute, every year they've been accumulating money and they're sitting on $100,000 of cash. And the county commissioners, the county argued back, well, but we're saving that for a different purpose, we've got a notion in mind, but they couldn't quantify exactly what that notion was. They didn't have a firm plan. And I think that really hurt them in the case. And I think it may be unique to Union County. I don't know many counties with a $100 million fund balance. And I'm certainly not suggesting that the county commissioners were acting inappropriately. That's perfectly legal to use fund balances as savings for future projects. But it came back to bite them in this case when they're arguing that they have lack of financial resources. And so I think one of the reasons that we saw a $91 million judgment was unique to the fact that the county in this case had a $100 million fund balance. Fund balance can work both ways, though, and as you'll notice, the fiscal constraints of the Board of Education also would be considered. And so fund balance at budget time between boards of education and county boards often becomes a contentious issue to the extent that a school board has fund balance. That is something that you as a board can take into consideration in making your appropriation. And it is something that can be argued if you ultimately got to litigation that, well, wait a minute, school board's asking for $2 million more than we want to give, but they have $1.5 million sitting in fund balance. So we, justify not using that fund balance for this purpose as opposed to coming to ask the county for more money. And so that fund balance can work both ways. And it is something, again, it's part of a negotiation. It's part of that step one in the process. The boards meet, try to understand each other's both financial goals and financial picture. Okay, let me finish up really quickly. Here we'll go to this final question. So let's see, flip one more, go through the pies. Yes, can you direct how funds are spent? So assuming you can figure out how much you're actually required to appropriate, or figure out how much you as a board decide to appropriate each year to the school, can you direct how that money is spent? No. And the answer is actually sometimes. Sometimes. And this is, again, going back, everything's a balance. And this is that notion of when does using the power of the purse string actually infringe on policy-making authority, and when is it simply power of the purse string? And the General Assembly has given some guidance on this issue. And so we'll go to the next slide. And actually, if you can click it, a couple of, I'll tell you, 1, 2, click it 6 times. 3. There we go. Thank you. So these are the sources of local funds for public schools that are represented here. And they're on a continuum. And that continuum represents your degree of control over how those funds are spent as a board. And so the first pot of money, if you go to the next slide, county appropriations. This is the big local source of funds. You can appropriate general county money for both capital and operating, when you make those appropriations, you can either give a lump sum to the school board to say, here's your $6,000 trillion for operating and, 90 million for capital, right? I'm plugging for you. Or, alternatively, the statute allows you to direct those expenditures a little bit. And what it allows you to do is to direct them by purpose or function code. And I can't list all the purpose or function codes up on a slide, but in the handout, in the article that I sent earlier to you, it lists out those purpose and function codes. So for example, if you want all county dollars to go into the classroom, you can direct all county dollars to go into the classroom, thereby saying no county dollars can go to central administration, or no county dollars can go to facilities or general supplies. County dollars will go to classroom instruction. Now, you cannot, within classroom instruction, say county money will only go K through 3, or county money will only go for teacher assistants, or county money will only go to teacher supplements, legally. But you can say that county money can only go to a certain purpose or a certain function. And like I said, you have the exact contours of those codes in that article. And I'm certainly happy to answer a question about them. On the capital side, you can actually appropriate by project. And if the school board during the fiscal year doesn't want to do that project, either they forego the funds, or they have to come back to your board and request a change, an alteration, to use that money for a different project. So there is an ability, and we've seen some counties take advantage of this, to direct county monies to some extent. And it will be up to you to determine whether that makes sense given requests from the school board. Sometimes school boards request it according to function and purpose code. If your school board doesn't request their funds that way, but you'd like to see that breakout, you can use that statute I mentioned earlier and request that they submit their budget requests according to those chart of accounts and purpose codes so that you can see how the money breaks out according to the request.
Mr. Chairman, could I
Yeah.
inject a question here? Because that's kind of the meat of this.
Sure.
Am I understanding you to state that this board could in fact allocate a specific amount of dollars for a specific project?
So on the capital side, is that
On the
what?
capital side.
Yes. And so there are 3 categories in the budget code for capital. The first is for any construction or maintenance or repair projects to facilities, which is the bulk of what you fund, other than buses, perhaps. It's the bulk of what you fund at the local level. That can actually be allocated out by project. You don't have to do that way. You could simply allocate a lump sum, but you can allocate that on a project-by-project basis. Say, roof repair at school X number of dollars. If that money's not used for roof repair at school X, then the school board would have to come back and say, we'd like to have you do a budget amendment to reallocate that money to a different project. That is within your province. That is within the statutory authority you have to direct capital money to specific projects.
Inclusive of a facility.
Yes, so in terms of maybe be a little...
School A, building School A out here at X number of dollars.
Yeah, so if and let's talk a little bit about school facilities just to maybe create a holistic picture. The way school siting decisions are made is that where a school is located is completely up to a local school board.
Sure.
How much money is spent for that school is completely up to your board, obviously with the dispute resolution process sitting out there as sort of always kind of a specter over everything. What your ability to do budget-wise would be to say, let's say a school site is picked, and it's going to cost, the estimate is $30 million for a new school, then your budget could say $30 million for school at site X, for new high school at site X. It can be that specific.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to quickly run through the other pots of money. This is the one where you have the most control over. The other issue that typically comes up is debt. is issuing debt for schools. So this is, again, adding on to the uniqueness of how we do things in North Carolina versus in most states. Not only do we have the bulk of the funding coming from the state for schools, it may not feel like that, but that actually is true, but local school boards in North Carolina don't have taxing authority. So to the extent that they need to raise money for capital at the local level, it has to come through the counties almost always. There is some very limited authority for certain purchases that can be made by the school board itself with approval from the county commissioners, some certain lease agreements that can be entered into. But the bulk of the big funding for capital is going to come from counties, and counties are typically going to have to issue debt for the major dollar expenses. The ways that counties have to issue debt, this could be a whole nother presentation, but there are actually 5 methods by which you as a county are authorized to issue debt. And that's true. You can use 4 of those 5. Probably realistically, you're going to only use 2 of those 5 to issue debt for schools. One of it is going to be, your option is to issue general obligation bonds, which you may be familiar with as the type of debt that requires almost always voter approval. That's the voter referendum, typically the cheapest way to borrow money, but it has that pretty high hurdle, which is almost always requires a voter referendum. The other option, which does not require a voter referendum, which you can always use for schools, is something called installment financing. And that's just something that you as a board would vote on. There's certain process elements to it, including sometimes a public hearing, but it is something ultimately that your board has control over. So sometimes what I hear coming out of the debate between county boards and school boards is that the school board wants a GO bond referendum. School board wants GO bonds for school construction. Your board ultimately always has the authority whether or not to issue school bonds, whether or not to borrow money and how to borrow money, whether you're going to go ahead with and issue general obligation bonds, or whether you're going to do an installment financing, or whether you're going to use savings, or whether if you're Union County, you're going to use fund balance of that $100 million. You always maintain the full discretion, your board, as to how ultimately to fund school construction or school capital, period. This gets a little bit complicated though. There's a series of statutes that allows a county board to petition. And the county board can actually petition on its own, or it can receive a petition from citizens first, directing it to petition your board to put out for a voter referendum, issuing general obligation bonds for a particular school project, a particular school construction project. If your board receives that petition, this is where the lawyer is going to come in again, and I apologize. We think, based on the statutes, that your board is obligated to hold the voter referendum, and that means obligated to pay for that referendum. But you're never obligated, and I know this for sure, you're never obligated to ultimately issue those bonds. Meaning, even if the voters say yes, you still retain the right to say, you know what, we're going to finance this a different way. We're going to do an installment financing. We're not going to finance it at all, or we're going to finance it through savings, or we're going to put it off for 5 years. That's still ultimately your right. But if you read the statutes, I think there is a very strong argument that if you get this petition request from the school board, that you are compelled to put it out to voter referendum. Obviously, that's going to have some political consequences if you have a successful referendum. That may put some pressure on your board to act one way in a way that it wouldn't if you weren't holding that referendum. But legally, you still can say no, even if you have a successful referendum. Why I'm hedging on that a little bit is we don't have any case law, and I can also make an argument that because of the way the debt structure is set up, your board always gets to decide whether to hold a referendum or not, despite what this statute seems to suggest. So it is one of those lawyer conundrums where until we get some case law one way or the other, we're not going to know for sure, or until the legislature clarifies. But I would say that if I were to give advice, if you get a valid petition from the school board requesting a referendum, I think you probably have to hold that referendum. And if the referendum is successful, you don't have to issue the debt, but you probably have to hold the referendum. And that's a question that comes up a lot in sort of this relationship between school board and commissioners.
Quick question. If you did go and you lost the referendum, how does that play out in dispute resolution?
So
Or are you getting to that?
yeah,
Okay.
oh no, I'm not, but that's a great question. So if let's say you got a petition from the school board, whether you got a petition or not, let's say you put a particular school project out to vote a referendum to fund for GO bonds, and that referendum fails, which they sometimes do, even for schools. That referendum fails. How does that play in if you go back to the county, or if you go back to the school board and say, you know what, the citizens don't want this. They've sent a clear message. They don't want us to raise taxes. They don't want this. So we're not funding it this year. Well, the reality is that the school board still can say, but we need it. The citizens may not want to pay for it, but in order to meet our minimum constitutional standards, we need another facility. We're too overcrowded. We're not able to satisfy our minimum basic education responsibilities with our current facilities. We need it. They could still institute the dispute resolution process. The fact that it is a failed voter referendum doesn't come into play. Doesn't come into play. What will come into play is what I had on the screen earlier, which is your financial resources, fiscal policies, the school board's needs, the school board's requests. It'll go back to that argument. Because if you think about it, what I just said earlier is you have lots of options nominally available to you to fund this school. GO bonds is only one option. And all the voters rejected at the referendum, they didn't reject the project. What they rejected is funding that project through GO bonds. Now, I know we can all say practically, no, they're probably rejecting the project too. But legally, that's not what's happened. And that's why it doesn't play directly into the dispute resolution process. Okay, so debt's the other major big one. I'm going to take 2 more minutes and flip through to the end here. Sales and use tax is really just a pass-through. You're able to generate, you have the authority to have county sales and use tax, local sales and use tax. Some of that money is shared with municipalities, but of the portion that you get to keep as a county, some of it's earmarked. Has to be used for a public school capital outlay, unless you get a special exemption from the local government commission. But that's all considered in your appropriation. So the fact that you're using that earmarked money is not over and above what you otherwise would appropriate from your unrestricted money. It's all part of that same pot. If we go on, voted supplemental tax. I don't know if you have one. Do you have a voted supplemental tax?
Not now, yes.
Not now. Okay, so this is an option that's out there. We're seeing. It's funny that these seem to go through cycles. We had a lot of counties with voted supplemental tax, then they sort of faded away, and now we're seeing a resurgence. This is a way for the school board, again, this is one we know that if the school board petitions you, you have to put this out for referendum. There's no gray on this one. If the school board petitions, you put this out for referendum. If the voters approve an additional targeted supplemental tax for schools, then it is up to, the voters will approve a maximum amount. Each year, the school board can make a request for how much they want you to levy up to that maximum amount. And then you get to ultimately decide whether to levy it at all up to the amount requested by the school board. So let's say the maximum amount approved by the voters is 15 cents. School board makes a request that you levy 10 cents this year. In this year, you can levy 0 cents or anywhere between 0 and 10. So you can levy none of that. You always have control over levying the tax. You can say, no, despite what the voters voted for, we're not doing that. We're not going to levy that tax. But your maximum isn't the maximum that the voters voted. It's the maximum that was requested by the school board. So it's a little bit of back and forth in terms of controlling that.
The additional property tax levy, it would have to be countywide?
Yes. So there is no, we do have some authority in North Carolina to create special taxing districts. That authority does not exist for school funding. So no, I should say it's not countywide, it's school district-wide. And so if you have, do you have multiple school districts in Wayne?
Just one.
Just one. So it would be countywide here. It would be, sorry, pardon me for that. It's school district-wide, but with one school district, it would effectively be countywide.
Could you then, could you ask countywide tax, but within that designated for a certain school or?
Not for a certain school, but the voters, when the petition comes in to what's going to go on the voter referendum, that petition can specify whether the money will be used for XYZ purposes. So we've seen some voted supplemental tax can only be used for capital. Some voted supplemental tax can only be used for operating expenses. Some can only be used for teacher supplements. It's whatever the voters specify and vote on at the voter referendum is how the money must be spent. But it would not be allowed to be directed only to one school.
So just to go back and clear, it would be a voter referendum for the whole county to say that you could use it for capital. And just as a question, have you seen where counties might do that for a tax for a certain specific period of time that met a specific request, and then there'd be a sundown or whatever you want to call it automatically kick in?
Yeah, so great question. So what the law does not allow, and in fact it would violate provisions related to the referendum. The law would not allow either the school board or the county board to say, we're only going to levy this tax for a period of time and then it sunsets. The law does not allow an automatic sunset, nor does it allow either board to suggest that even though legally we can't put a sunset, we will. We promise you we will, because particularly your board and the composition of your board may change over time. You always have to reserve the right. You can't sort of contract away that authority. You can't promise away that authority. A future board may decide differently, and they have the legal right to do so. So what we've seen in practice, though, is that sometimes this supplement is only for a limited period of time, and I talked about these cycles where there actually is a process to abolish the tax. And so when you're levying the tax, you can't promise the citizens or the voters anything about when it might be abolished. But if, in fact, you only need that additional tax for a 5-year period, the need goes away, then there is a process whereby you can abolish that voted supplemental tax. It takes another process, but it's not an automatic sunset that can be set up at the beginning, nor can it be used to sell the voters on voting yes for this, to promise this sunset.
So just one final thing. Last year, this board voted to reduce the tax by some certain sense. 3 points, okay. Then the board didn't ask the public, could we do this? It was voted and it happened. So does that follow that this board could put a certain amount of tax back in and designate it for a certain purpose?
Okay, so
is that a combination could that possibly happen?
So you're talking about the general property tax now, not a voted supplement. So you're talking about the general property tax.
Right.
So yeah, so it's actually not widely understood, but when you levy your general property tax, you're actually levying a whole bunch of individual taxes. The statute set out all the purposes for which you can levy taxes, which is most of what you do as counties. And even though you may not present it this way, you usually present it as a uniform rate. You don't break it out typically on the property tax bill. Effectively, legally, what you've done is, let's say you have a 20-cent tax rate. You're effectively levying 1 cent for fire services, 2 cents for EMS, 3 cents for general administration, 5 cents for schools, etc. And so you could list that out on your property tax bill and recognize that that's what's being done. You could also do a hybrid where you could say, okay, let's say you had 20 cents, now you have 17 cents. You could list 17 cents to cover everything, and then you could separately list 3 cents that will be used for school. And you could list that on the property tax bill. You could explain that that's what you're levying. Here's the thing, though. You can't legally bind yourself to using the money for that purpose. Meaning, if in the middle of the fiscal year, your board changes its mind or has a fiscal crisis in another area, you are free to redirect that money to other purposes. Even listing it out on the property tax bill is being dedicated to a particular purpose. And I haven't seen it with schools, but I have seen it with fire, where a county will list out fire, even though they're not legal fire tax districts. They'll pull out fire from the general property tax rate and list it separately, because sometimes people feel more comfortable paying tax for a particular service like fire. They may similarly feel comfortable paying a specific tax for schools. that doesn't legally bind you to use it for that purpose.
But you could, but just like anything else, if an emergency comes up in any form of life, you have to redirect yourself. But the answer to that is, you could be very specific for a certain tax to go to a certain project.
Absolutely. The only way to lock yourselves in would be to do it through this voted supplemental tax. You couldn't divert this tax to other purposes. But yes, if you wanted to use general property tax and just list it out, it would be a way to show the public what you intend, at least at the beginning of the year, to use the money for.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm actually going to flip through one last thing here. Talk just very quickly, and then I'll sit down or answer any more questions about the public school building capital fund. And so questions come up sometimes about, well, how's the state helping us out here? Quite frankly, the short answer is the state still provides the most of the operating funds. State still provides about 86% of the operating funds for schools across the state. That's how they're helping. And so it could be a lot worse. There could be a lot more pressure on local governments on the local property tax to fund schools than there is. But there is an additional way in which the state has helped with facilities costs. And the pot of money available for this help has shrunk significantly over the past few years. So several years ago, the General Assembly set up what we call the Public School Building Capital Fund. When it was initially set up, it was to funnel a portion of the state's corporate income tax, which were allocated based on average daily membership, which I'll point to my head because it's basically student head count. Average daily membership is a little bit of a shorthand for student head count. It was apportioned out by county according to the average daily membership numbers. That money was then able to be applied for jointly by a county board and the school board for specific capital projects or some technology projects. And that money required a match, actually, of local dollars to state dollars. That has now gone away. Before that went away, and it's gone away completely, it was for a while being diverted by the General Assembly. This past session, they repealed the law altogether, which I think was a little bit stronger statement of the fact that it's probably not going to come back anytime soon. There was a little bit of overlap, but what we have now left in this public school capital fund are lottery dollars. So it used to be, in addition to that corporate income tax, when we got the state lottery, a portion of the lottery money was directed to this fund as well, allocated out by not allocated by ADM, it was allocated by a much more complicated formula. In recent years, though, what the General Assembly did is override that statute and simply allocate $100 million total to be spread out by ADM, according to ADM, amongst the counties. And again, this past year, the General Assembly repealed the statutes, and now basically said this is going to be subject to budget appropriations each year. So this year there was $100 million. There's projected to be $100 million for the second part of the biennium of the state budget. But it's uncertain going forward whether and how much of this money might be available. The lottery money, again, both the school board and your board have to jointly apply and use that money for a specific capital project. There is no local match requirement for the lottery funds, but they can only be used on public school instructional buildings, not central administration or other types of admin buildings. But that there is still some money available, at least in the short term, coming from the state for that purpose. Yeah.
Comment, the association last week took a stand on the statutes 40% rule of the 100 million. The wordage somewhat is vague about what they're going to do with the 40%.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't seen what the associations, I haven't seen the language that they've proposed in terms of, but I'm sure that there's going to be some lobbying efforts on all sides on this.
And I guess I'm glad you brought that up, because what we've seen from the school board is some projections based on ADM, but now it's cut out, okay, based on lottery funds over a 5, 10, 15, 20-year period out in funding or supporting, sustaining any lending practices, sustaining that debt.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I will say, in repealing the statutory directives, the General Assembly could always override the statutes, which they had done for the past few years. But in repealing them, I think that will have an effect on the debt market in the fact that now all money coming from the state is subject to yearly budget appropriations, and anything that's subject to yearly budget appropriations, as you know, is not guaranteed in any way, and I think the debt market will be very suspect of relying on that money in any fashion in terms of guaranteeing future revenue streams.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Is she finished? I'm enjoying this.
If, you know, keep on.
Oh, no, I'm done unless there's questions.
You have one more slide, Karen.
Yeah, I think I'm going to skip that one because it's more an administration slide. We'll stop here.
Mr. Bate.
I was gonna say, I've got a number of questions, and time doesn't allow for us to go through all that today. Could we just submit those to her, and I'm sure the commissioners have questions as well, and that we could, you know, come back and get the answers and share, you know, school board as well? Because I do have a number of questions, and I appreciate you coming down today, because I've seen you speak twice. This is the third time, actually, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure.
Is that the pleasure of the board to submit our questions and? Appreciate your
Sure.
presentation.
No problem.
Mr. Parker, do you have any questions?
I'd just like to remind you and the public that she is from the School of Government at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She didn't wear her light blue like I had hoped. But that is one of the finest institutions in the state of North Carolina. They teach everybody in local and state governments at every level. As you say, 3 of you went up last week, a week before last, and I'm going 2 weeks from now, so she can teach me. She said she taught county attorneys, and you've all indicated that I need a lot of teaching. And I appreciate what she does for me.
Mr. Chairman, we need to take a time out to take that DVD out.
Okay. 3 minutes? 3-minute break.
Is this a real 3-minute?
Yeah, I'm gonna start in 3 minutes, whether you hear or not.
We got to leave that thing.
We need to get the shirt.